Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Now let's have our next speaker, Celyn Bricker. Celyn Bricker is a British visual artist whose work explores technology and our relationship to nature. He examines themes like AI technology, biodiversity, and environmental change through digital art, painting, installation, and curatorial projects. Now let's have Celyn. Hello, Celyn.
Hello.
Hi, now you can share your PowerPoint.
Okay. Can you all see?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, well, yes, thank you very much for having me today. It's a great honor to be part of the conference. My name is Celyn Bricker, and I'm an artist from the UK, and I often use AI as part of my artistic practice, as though I often focus on nature and themes of biodiversity. Today, I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. So quickly sharing a few examples of what I've done in the past. I often use AI to create generative works or works that are about AI itself, or sometimes using AI as the starting point for more traditional forms of working in terms of painting and sculpture. But in this example, I'm using it as part of an interactive installation. So this is nice musical accompaniment. So in this piece, the AI is used in a way that is only visible when someone is actually directly looking at it. So it has this interactive aspect to it. Or in works like this, which when only when people were approaching the work or getting close to the screen, did it react, and the image would bleach out and distort. This was actually an environmental piece. It was talking about coral bleaching, but it was also talking about AI as being something like an organism whose processes of thinking in a way could be disturbed by human presence. And other times I use AI as inspiration for painting, as in this series of works, where in a way it's the forms that an AI can generate using a GAN that offers a kind of machine kind of inspiration for physical work. So although today this is kind of some background about some recent projects, rather than talking about these in general, I'm going to focus on one project in particular, and then talk about in the general system that makes my my projects possible in a way, and that in a way is actually the imagination of other people. But as a way in to explore the project, I'm going to talk about this idea of a digital ready-made. So if you're not familiar with the idea of a ready-made, it's quite an old term now in our history in a way. It was created by Marcel Duchamp, going back to the 1910s. The first piece being probably this, the bottle rack from 1914, but the most famous, of course, being this called Fountain in 1917. Although it wasn't really until the 1960s that the true impact was really felt of this work, when you had the conceptual art movement. And so in each of the ready-mades, Duchamp was taking an existing object and then designating it art. And he did this using the institution of the gallery and the context of the gallery, as well as himself introducing this concept of the artist as the individual who could determine what art was or was not. This concept still had power to shock nearly a century later, because you had works like this in the late 90s, sorry, from YBA artist Tracy Emin, which was surprisingly shocking for a 100-year-old idea. But if these are what you might think of as the traditional or physical ready-made, what would a contemporary ready-made look like? Or yeah, what could it be today? And so one place you might think of is, this was a newspaper article at the time. You might think about the digital space, of course. So a digital ready-made could be something you might think initially like an artist using a YouTube clip or a pre-existing digital file, or something that they could find online and integrate into their artwork. So this is an early example again of something like this way of working, which was Mark Leckey, who used clips he found on YouTube as sort of digital found objects, and then used these as the raw material for his pieces. I'm thinking of something a little bit different in this case, and in the terms of AI, or in terms of my work, or many other artists using AI, I think there are other ways to understand the idea of the ready-made. So it could be, of course, the text or images that are generated by an AI itself, or if you step back a layer, it would be the code itself. And I'm thinking more specifically about open source code in this context. So in terms of resources of this kind of ready-made code, there's now really huge resources for artists, and not just artists, for programmers, everybody, on sites such as GitHub, and there are all these collaborative notebooks, and also newly developed applications where artists or individuals can make use of AI models directly. And given, of course, the excitement and allure of these models, ever increasing numbers of artists are using them to create work, and I count myself amongst these, using AI in this way as a creative tool for making, as well as making AI specific work. So I count myself as a growing wave of artists, in a way, who are using this kind of newly accessible AI technology, which you can find on GitHub, to explore these possibilities in technology. And in my own mind, I make some kind of a distinction, in a way, between artists who can utilize and adapt to existing code that would be open source, perhaps, and then earlier, or I guess more advanced in some way, people who are building their own architecture, building their own code from scratch. So a famous and a slightly controversial example of this would be between the group Obvious and Robbie Barrett, because you had someone like Robbie Barrett, who was was a developer and an early experimenter with AI, and someone also who was making use of GitHub as a place for him to offer his code for free for others to experiment with. So for him, and then for others, it was a little bit eyebrow raising when the group Obvious seemed to use a very similar kind of code to create their work, which they then sold at Christie's. Of course, Obvious had their own particular achievement, in a way, in that they were able to leverage the public understanding or lack of understanding of AI work at the time. But in a way, despite their success at the auction, I felt that in a way they actually missed a slightly more interesting, imaginative opportunity, because had they been a bit more transparent about what they were doing, then maybe it would have been a little bit less surprising for people like Robbie Barrett, but then they could have also presented their work in this Duchampian vein, in a way, and presenting it as a ready-made for the 21st century. So it was partly this missed opportunity, in a way, as I saw it, that I wanted also to explore in my own work, as well as using this idea of the ready-made as a way to explore broader questions around AI and imagination, AI and creativity, and then even things like AI and taxation, or AI's impact on society. So to explain this project in which I made use of a ready-made, I'll just give some brief background. So in 2020, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine called Arturo Muela, who's based in Mexico City. And he told me that he needed to pay his taxes soon. And to do so, he needed to make some artwork. I didn't quite understand, but he explained to me that if in Mexico you are registered as an artist, you're permitted to give the government an artwork as payment in kind, instead of giving them their money directly. So every year, artists could give the government a painting or a sculpture or something. And if the work was accepted, then it would enter into the government's national collection. So after I got over this shock, and a kind of amazement at this policy, which does strike me as a particularly imaginative tax policy, I then became very fascinated by some of the possibilities. Given my interest in AI, I also saw this as an opportunity to create some work that raised a number of questions. At the time, I was also very interested in the question around whether AI should pay tax. And that's obviously a big discussion worthy of debate in itself, and something that we definitely should be thinking about because of the way in which AI is replacing or potentially replacing humans and therefore their taxes in the workforce. But I was also interested in using the mechanism of the Mexican government as a way to play with the question: are AI generated images art? Because the logic of the policy meant they could only accept art. And then this in itself was opening questions around AI and creativity and AI and imagination, because implicit in this process would be the AI replacing the activity of a human artist. So if they accepted the images, they would therefore the AI produced image would therefore officially be declared art at a kind of national governmental level. And Arturo and I thought this was also a very interesting way to revisit some of those ideas that Duchamp raised in the early ready-mades, but rather than using the gallery as the institutional context, you're using this something a more complicated institution, which would be this government and government policy. So to make my work, I searched for a digital ready-made I could use, and I took a text-to-image AI, which was developed by Tao Xu and others here, as the basis for making the work, given that it had a very permissive license of use, which is something I was wanting to be careful about, and it was also freely available on GitHub. So this is a sort of thing that this model was built to do. And compared to things like DALL-E 2 or the more recent, the Google image gen, this text-to-image model now looks, really quite outdated, and that's very, striking in itself, given how far and how quickly things have moved in just a few years. And this model, which is trained on the COCO data set, can make these quite, reasonably convincing images of birds and so on, or at least it was reasonably convincing at the time. But I decided to take this model and use it in a different direction. So I collected these different quotations that related to ideas around technological displacement, so losing your job to a machine or to an AI, and then early descriptions of robots, the impacts of technology, and these other things which related to AI's impact on society. And I used this catalog of quotations as the inputs for the AI, which then created a series of quite strange and mysterious images. And when you're thinking about artificial imagination as a topic, then sometimes these kinds of images can often offer an interesting way into that discussion, because the relationship to the original text was in many ways is quite hard to define when I show you the image in a minute. And I would find it quite hard to tell you exactly how the model generated the particular image that it did. Here is an example, the left being the input and then the right is the output. I'll just share a few examples from this. This first one is from a very ancient Chinese text, actually, called the Liezi. And in this text, it describes an inventor called Yan Shi, who creates, well, I think is the first reference to a robot or an automaton. And in this story, the automaton or the robot starts singing and dancing for the emperor, but then it begins to flirt with the emperor's concubines, maybe letting its imagination get away from it, get ahead of itself. And then to save his own life, the inventor, Yan Shi, had to quickly take apart the robot and show the emperor that it was only made of different materials, basically. So I find this also an interesting story because it's a kind of moral, in a way, on also the idea of ownership and culpability in regard to machines and their creators, which is also interesting for us to consider in terms of AI, of course, because in the story, Yan Shi saves his own life by showing the emperor it's only a robot, even if it's a robot that he's made. But AI now asks us to consider more difficult questions about not just ownership and things like copyright, who owns the output of an AI, but more complex moral questions around culpability, especially when AI is integrated into any decision making. But in the story, Yan Shi can just deconstruct the robot to show the emperor. But in many AI systems, it can't be deconstructed in the same way. So what happens inside the AI can often be a bit black boxy or a bit mysterious or inexplicable, and sometimes can be have some surprises for those that have made them, which in some ways maybe is like Yan Shi's robots flirting of its own volition with the concubines. This one that we created was using an AI itself. Also, like Yan Shi's robot, was one that was switched off. This is text from the Facebook chatbots called Alice and Bob, who were talking to one another, and it was reported as talking to one another in a language that no one could understand, and they had to be immediately disconnected, which is a little bit dramatic, I think. That was how it was reported at the time in 2017. But when you see actually what they were saying to each other, you could sort of think, it looks to me a little bit more they were just getting stuck in some kind of loop, but we don't know. This was another one also from an AI itself, which was from a chatbot called Eugene Gustman, who passed or partially passed the Turing test, in fact, by convincing a number of judges that it was actually a young Ukrainian boy, despite often speaking in these quite surreal or unexpected ways, as you can see from the title of the work, which is "My Guinea Pig Sends His Regards," which comes from something that Eugene said to the judges. We also included contemporary references like this sort of comment from Elon Musk, talking about AI as being a fundamental risk to human society, as well as much older things, which were still connected to this idea of technological replacement in a way, this being from the Luddites in England, who at the time, the early industrial revolution went around smashing up machines, newly developed machines. Although we refer now as someone, as a Luddite, to someone who's perhaps lacking in imagination, someone resistant to new technology. Those Luddites actually were people who were just were resisting their jobs being removed effectively. So I think they were an interesting early example of this kind of upheaval that you can see socially or politically through new technologies. So in each case, the means that the text-to-image model created the image was often unexpected, sometimes a bit inexplicable, and nevertheless it had some sort of abstract impression of the original text. Although it's not quite right to call it imaginative, I think the outputs nevertheless were something that were a bit outside what I would have necessarily imagined initially when trying to come up with interpreting or responding to these texts. So after we collected and created these works, we submitted them to the Mexican government. And then there's a specific department in that government who examine the work, and then they decide if it really constitutes art or not. And after some period of deliberation, the government did finally approve them, and they were said to officially be art. And then they allowed these AI-generated works to enter into the national collection alongside human artists in a way. So both Arturo and I were very pleased that this worked out, and pleasantly surprised by, I suppose, also the imagination and openness of the Mexican government department. So while the issues we were raising in this work go beyond just the ready-made that I began talking about, it was also trying to raise these broader questions about AI, creativity, and imagination, AI and society. But nevertheless, the whole piece is only really possible because of this existence of ready-made accessible code. So there's a few things I'm going to just reflect on to finish. Coming from the art world, coming as an artist, I'm really interested in this difference of cultures in a way between open source and the art world, because open source in a way it embodies a philosophy that's sometimes can actually be in conflict with, I think, the art world in general, because open source has this culture of which is of transparency and clarity, and the art world in some ways can often be quite opaque, or deliberately opaque, really. So, and you can think about the case of individual artists, where an artist might go to great lengths to develop his or her technique and the specific methods of creating the work. They might want to conceal or not necessarily reveal to everyone how they make what they do. But of course, open source is totally different. And the goal being something that, collectively working together towards better and more efficient code or technology. So in that sense, it is a collective effort, whereas often the work of an individual artist is not, or it can sometimes not be presented as such, even if an individual artist is working collectively. Of course, there are exceptions to this. I'm talking kind of general terms. So in a way, really, it's the openness and the democratization of knowledge around AI that's allowed this development, rapid development in recent years. But most artists are often engaged in very individualized, often deeply personal research, and spending a career that is in a way developing their own language, developing their own artistic language. So in a way, the contemporary artist, this was, yeah, an example of what I just meant. So the contemporary artist is in some way, yeah, working on developing their own language, which is a kind of, yeah, almost like a Wittgensteinian task of developing your own language, which in a way, of course, is something which you cannot use to communicate with other people. But the languages of open source, by contrast, are essentially unified, and they allow the collective to explore these particular goals. Sorry. Yeah, and then taking a kind of different tack, or looking at it from an art historical perspective in a different way. I think of also these developments in AI in a way picking up a thread in our history that goes back not just to Renaissance, but even further back to ancient Greek culture, because you can think about one aspect of Western art history, at least, which is the attempt to create these ever more perfect reflections of reality. And you can see this is not an ancient Greek sculpture, but it's referring to an ancient Greek story of Pygmalion, where the sculptor created a work so perfect that it came to life in a way. So you can see this idea in ancient Greece, and then in the Italian Renaissance, you saw this explosion of artistic activity, which was somehow inseparable from scientific inquiry in some way. They're using art at the time not just as a way to better understand reality, but actually they were imitating it, of course, as closely as possible. And those two things, the understanding of reality and its imitation, were inseparably linked together. So in a way that the imitation of reality was a means by which to better understand reality. And now we can see this with AI, I think, as you have developments in creating these ever more accomplished models that teach us about our own understanding of reality. And these new AI models are causing us to rethink our understanding of the mind, to rethink our understanding of imagination and creativity. I'm not thinking necessarily these Renaissance artists are always sharing work in this open source kind of a way, because competition was central to what they were doing. This is a famous example of a competition between Leonardo and Michelangelo. But in a way, this exchange of ideas was still crucial. And the achievements of these artists in the past, in some ways, where they did link up with science in that way, they were possible because they were, everyone was moving in a kind of mutually understood and definable direction. And this is not really possible in contemporary art, but is absolutely the case in terms of AI and technological development. So I think in some ways the like the competing workshops of Michelangelo and Leonardo of Venice and Florence maybe would be something closer to the competition between two organizations like this today, between something like DeepMind and OpenAI or some other AI studios or companies rather. So although I began by invoking Duchamp rather than Michelangelo or Leonardo, really, to talk about this kind of ready-made character of open source code, I think in a way I could think that the contemporary version of the Sistine Chapel is more likely to be on GitHub than any actual physical ceiling. So to the analogy really with any artistic achievement of the past can only go so far. And because open source code, of course, has its own particular issues present that are relevant to the present moment. And in our historical terms, what Duchamp did was a kind of conceptual time bomb that didn't really detonate for 50 years. It wasn't until the 60s, because the kind of imaginative leap he took wasn't really recognized in the moment. It took until the conceptual art movement. However, using the current moment with these freely accessible AI models is something quite different, given the power that they have. And many of these are more like conceptual time bombs that can detonate immediately, because these open source models can often pose much more complex moral challenges than just those around copyright. And they can create more difficult ethical situations than just simply using that code to sell your art. And these challenges are going to get only more complex. And that's why it's also incumbent on artists to consider the ethical use and implications of these changing AI models that we're going to have easier and easier access to. And for artists to better imagine the possible futures with AI, as Chen Xiaofan was just talking about. I did just mention OpenAI, and of course they created the DALL-E and now the DALL-E 2 model, which they only released to a limited number of people, because I think not just financially, but also they also recognize the power of these models and their influence on society. So although they built in these safeguards, it's very easy to imagine how a model like that, the full code or the architecture of it is not going to be hidden forever, or even for very long. And I think it won't be too long until we find something like DALL-E 2, at least, that's going to be more readily available. So the top on the screen here is the DALL-E, and then below is a Russian version, RuDALL-E, which is more easily accessible. It's not quite as effective. You can get some idea of some of the teething problems they're having from the training data, because you can see iStock popping up on quite a lot of their generated images. But nevertheless, there are websites now like Hugging Face, it's called, which is committed to putting out all open source versions of all machine model learnings that it can find. And they even have a kind of mini DALL-E, they call it, which is improving rapidly on that website. So in my case, just to conclude, when I was submitting work to the Mexican government, I was, of course, playing with this idea of the artist being replaced by a machine. And for a long time, when you looked at what a safe job from AI would be, often artist was ranked pretty high. But of course, things like DALL-E 2 have caused a lot of concern amongst certain members of the artistic community. And these are going to become greater, I think, as they become more readily accessible. Because outputs from something like DALL-E 2 or Google Image Gen show something on the surface, at least, looks like a kind of imagination or creativity in the variation of outputs it can create from a single description. Whether you really think of it as imagination or not is a different question. But if you rank it just on the number of outputs and styles, it's already very impressive and offers a kind of challenge to the artistic imagination. So what I think of really as the thing for artists, or as the challenge for people to consider, is to think of using human imagination in a different way, because presented with this vast range of ready-made outputs, which in things like DALL-E, they can sort of act as a step in for human imagination, visual imagination in some sense. Of course, you have to be very creative in the prompts you give and so on. But the artists had to think, I think, more strategically about what to do with AI models. In my case, I could have, of course, just used the text-to-image model to create these kinds of slightly abstract, unusual works. But in a way, it was really the action of submitting to the government that was the art in that project. And then it's that part that requires something much more particular to the human imagination, because it's in this social or relational or political space that the human imagination has this more crucial role. So I think, as artists, the questions we should ask ourselves then are things more like, with these more powerful open source models like DALL-E coming in the pipeline, what as an artist will you do with those ready-made outputs? And how as an artist can you engage with the social, societal impacts of freely accessible models? And how can you draw out the ethical implications of an openly accessible model? And how can you better engage with people and with the society to understand or to help people imagine what the impact of AI is going to be? And how can you help them better imagine that future? Again, this is going back to what Chuan-Chou was just talking about. Because I feel these ultimately are the more interesting creative questions to consider. And I think we're very fortunate also to live in a time when there are these vast resources open for us to explore. And in some ways, I think these questions are ones that really lie beyond the reach of an AI to answer, or at least they do at the moment. Thank you very much. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Celyn.